don't know whether it's actually recorded.
There's a poster there. There's actually a postdoc on it who's a background in music engineering, but animals as well. He went to China Friday, on Thursday. That's fine. Might what time is it?
Just a few minutes. Yeah, we'll just let people filter in. We're already recording, so the people remotely know that something's happened.
I'm recording myself. No, it's fine.
Because this was the only road.
How's these going?
Okay, please consider this one. Slides like this, and yeah.
So are you looking at the live transmission?
Yeah, so that's how they can see with the delay, so that's what you can see yourself. Back to the picture we go. You can see the slides quite well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shy.
See what I can
I'll give people a few more minutes.
Yeah, that's all.
We're not too punctual.
You've been rating at the end of
I was in Australia in July, then I came back, I had a week of regular work, and then I had to do jury service for 2 weeks, so I was at a Blackfriars Crown Court over there.
I've been called up for that side step when I was working abroad.
It was quite stressful.
There's two seats at the front also. There's two more if you want. Do you want to sit front row? Front row seat? Front row?
That would be more interesting.
No, I'm delighted by it.
There's a couple of seats.
Yesterday. Things are cheap now, but that's beautiful.
I think we're here, so that's
Oh, of course, yeah. It's fine, no worries.
It is tomorrow.
I think I've only just paid for it actually myself anyway, so I've got to actually bought it and paid already, so I've got the rest.
Yeah. I think I just went for the fact that I finished on Friday. Well, 6 weeks.
No, it's not
No.
It's actually very nice to go.
Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming along to our latest instalment in the Animal Welfare Guest Lecture series. For those who are joining us remotely, Jen will be manning questions, so please feel free to type in any questions or participate from home. And I hope we've got a very excited team in Nicaragua who are joining us live for the first time. They say hello, that's great news. So welcome to everybody who's watching abroad as well. So I'm delighted that we've got Alan McGilligan here with us today, who is a professor in animal behaviour from the University of Roehampton, and I believe has a background in zoology originally, and has lectured at numerous universities, including University College Dublin, University of Zurich, Nottingham, Queen Mary, etc. I've done some research.
It means I'm old. I'm getting there.
And is currently doing quite a lot of research looking at animal behaviour, cognition and communication in various species, but is here with us today to tell us more about his research with goats. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jen and Ashleigh, for the invitation and having me over today to talk about goats to an equine charity. Actually, I realised many years ago when I was an undergraduate, I did my final year project on horses, believe it or not. But I was working on a salt marsh near Swansea on the Gower Peninsula from October to December, which, as you can imagine, was not good in terms of, luckily I grew up in Kerry in the southwest of Ireland, so I had known what horizontal rain and wind was like. Anyway, getting back to the content of today's talk, I've been working on goats. I did my PhD research years ago on deer, but not a welfare project, more behavioural ecology. We've been working on goats since when, about 2009, 2010. And the reason I switched to working on goats was because I thought that there was a bit of a gap in terms of knowledge at that time. I mean, goats are probably one of the most common livestock species across the planet. There are more than 1 billion goats on Earth, and that's from UN statistics. In the UK, they're not considered that important, but worldwide they certainly are, and particularly for middle and low-income countries. The other thing is, when I started working on goats, I was aware of one research lab in Germany doing some work on goats, but otherwise I didn't know of any work at that time. There's a bit more since, but that lab in Germany is continuing to do some research on goats. So I thought there was a lot of potential. Plus, in terms of, I grew up on a cattle farm years ago, and we had a couple of pet goats, believe it or not. And they always seemed, well, they seemed really interesting for some reason, and as I go through this, hopefully you'll see that as well. So we work at Buttercups, which is a sanctuary not far from London. It's about an hour's drive from southeast London, where I live. It's open to the public, actually just recently, within I think the past weekend. It's now not open every day of the week, but it is open at the weekends if anyone wants to visit during the winter months. As I said, and there are a couple of reasons for working there, and that's because they have about 130, 140 goats there. Not all of the goats are like this, but we want to do behavioral experiments and cognitive experiments which I will explain to you in a minute. But one of the reasons we do them there is because the animals are really used to being around people. And you can't do much of the research that I'm going to tell you about today unless the animals are used to being around people. Because if we want to lead the goat off into an experimental enclosure nearby, and we typically build our enclosures for the experiments just in the field, or we take them indoors, there are some barns there, the last thing you would want is stressed animals.
Sorry, we've already got a quote from online. Could you possibly talk just a little more slowly?
Oh, sorry, no problem. Okay. Anyway, so moving on. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit in terms of our perceptions, at least in Europe, North America and places like that. This is Jack the dog. He's actually not mine, but I borrow him a lot from a friend, and I see him at the weekends. And I had him over the weekend actually. And when it comes to how we treat dogs, I mean, they're like a member of the family. They live with us on our sofas. We're also good at telling when they're in a good mood or we're about to go to the park there. So I know Jack is quite happy, that's waiting for a train. So they're part of our everyday lives. So then when it comes to scenes like this from the Yulin Dog Meat Festival, which happens each year in China, there is uproar when people are faced with images of dogs being transported in small cages, or being in these cramped cages. And here we have dogs that have been slaughtered at this festival. So to me it's a little bit hypocritical, to be honest, because I mean, all animals deserve to be treated in the best way possible. but we don't really see any outcry as a result of the way many livestock species like goats are treated. Like, I know that there is generally controversy over live exports, for example, and there are protests, but usually that's a small segment of society. So there is a big disconnect between how we treat our domestic pets and how we view abuse of those pets. But some of the normal or routine treatment of goats, in this case, they're goats, that obviously a cow, but there is no uproar about the treatment that some of these animals actually endure. And one of the goals of my research overall, or I should say we, because it's a group effort, is to change perceptions of livestock species. And actually this photograph, I think I took it from a newspaper, I think that was Vietnam earlier in the year, and these were cattle that were live exported from Australia, and that cow, or bull, was actually killed using that sledgehammer. And of course there was uproar about this as well. So anyway, why do we study goats? As I said already, the numbers in the UK aren't that great, about 100,000, but they are growing. We've got about 12, 13 million in the EU, but globally there are more than 1 billion goats. So goats do really well under a whole range of conditions. So they're a production species, so they were domesticated to create milk in these cases. These are salmon goats, so dairy goats, so the females have big udders for producing milk. These of course are goats, they're not sheep, and obviously they are that breed has been developed for producing hair. And these are actually Boer goats, native to South Africa, but they are found all over the world now, and they're the goats that are typically used for meat production. And actually meat production, our goat meat consumption is growing in the UK as well, because it's become fashionable with various celebrity chefs over the past few years. But generally there was a gap in terms of our knowledge of goats, and that's one of the main reasons we switched into working on goats. So a little bit about domestication. So it's widely considered that dogs were the first species to be domesticated, and estimates vary, but maybe 20 or 30,000 years ago. But goats were the first livestock species to be domesticated, and the earliest remains were found in the Zagros Mountains, which are in present-day western Iran, so sort of semi-arid mountains. I haven't been there. But this is part of the Fertile Crescent, where many of our crops and other domestic animals were domesticated. And goats are the earliest remains. There was a paper published in Science in 2001, and the earliest remains are about 10,500 years ago. So dogs are the first domesticated, thought to be the first domesticated species, but goats are the first domesticated livestock species. And thought to have been domesticated from Capra gagris, which is still alive today actually, found in Southeast Europe, but low numbers. I think it's classified as endangered. And yes, potentially it would be nice to work on animals like that, but you need habituated animals for doing the sort of research that we do. So generally, public perception of goats is that they're sort of running around, they're a bit stupid, they eat anything that they come across. There are loads of movies, and people send me links from YouTube and stuff. Actually, often those movies are sheep, not goats at all, but there is a general public perception of sort of just running around. And when I was growing up, they were certainly featured in cartoons and animations as sort of just running around eating and not really thinking. And a bit like that. And particularly in the last few years, goat clips on YouTube with them making strange noises. So there is a general public perception of them just being a bit dumb. So hopefully in these topics that I'm going to tell you about in the next sort of half hour, less than that actually, I'm going to summarize some of the work we've been doing on their intelligence, and as a measure of their intelligence, how good they are at problem solving, how we can study their emotions and mood, human-directed behaviors, and actually finally finish off with stuff that was just published at the end of August this year in terms of good perception of human emotions. And one of the key differences that I come back to again and again is goats were domesticated, as I told you, for production. So hair, meat, milk. They weren't domesticated to be companion animals or pets like horses or dogs. So of course, often they're not expected to be able to do the things that those companion animals are able to do. But this is actually Bob Hitch, who was the founder of Buttercups. I think Buttercups is 27 or 28 years old now, and they've basically pulled in a trailer full of hay, and the goats have rushed in and are using the top goat here. I think his name is Nip, I could be wrong. But they've basically rushed in, or that goat has rushed in and used the opportunity to get the green leaves off the trees overhead. The other thing is, if you ever go to Buttercups, you will notice many of the goats are unrelated, but they form really strong pair bonds. So they're really bonded socially closely to one another. So these two are always found together. And I don't go, I mean, my students go to Buttercups more often than me, but even I notice these particular pairs of goats that hang around with each other. During the day, they're released into one or two big fields of Buttercups, and then they're all put indoors at night for security. So first of all, we were interested, we had anecdotal evidence that goats were particularly good at sort of problem solving. People at the goat sanctuary told us about the problems of keeping the goats in at night, for example, because they're able to open doors, all that sort of stuff. If you talk to goat farmers, I mean, you also have to have fencing like Fort Knox to keep them in, because they're really good at getting out. But we wanted a way of testing their cognitive abilities. So how clever are they? So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel per se. So we borrowed a technique from the primate literature, or work that had been, or a technique that had been used in primates like chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas, for example. So we used this artificial fruit thing that I'll explain in a minute, which was developed by Andy Whiten, who's a primatologist or a psychologist who works at St Andrews in Scotland. And the key aspect of the artificial fruit task for an animal, I mean, it's long been known, or you can train an animal like a pigeon or a rat or stuff for years to, well, in the case of a pigeon, peck on a light and get a food reward, or a rat to press a lever and get a food reward. The key difference with the artificial fruit task that we did is it's a two-step. So the animal has to perform the first step before it can do the second step, so the two are linked. So it's thought to be far more cognitively challenging for the two. So it's not a simple press a buzzer and get food. You have to do one thing and then do the next. So our version of this, which was built by Luigi Baccidonna, my PhD student who finished last year, was a large plastic box. It's about this size, basically. Inside there is a small food reward in a bowl. You can sort of see it through the almost clear perspex box. The goat, or the animal in this case, has to come up to it, pull out the lever, and then lift up the lever, and it tilts the food into the bowl here, and it gets a food reward. But the key thing is the animal has to pull out the lever before it can push up the lever. The other thing is we attached a piece of string just to make it easier for them to grip it. And I have a movie to show you what they actually did. So that's Willow. I'm going to show you a series of the goats. Some of the goats are better than others at doing it, but there are several of them. And it worked a few minutes ago, so please work now. So this is Willow up first.
Yeah, she didn't want to bend the rope. Some of them were
So the food reward in this case is actually dried penne pasta, which they love. This is Bobbin. I don't know all the names, I can't remember them. But as you can see, they're pretty good at this. No, they got some training. So in terms of the training, Elodie Briefer worked on this actually. And the they had to learn the first part of the task before the second part of the task. But they got it really quickly. The training happened. They weren't trained directly, I should say. They were introduced to it, and it was a bit of trial and error and a bit of training. But basically, of the 12 goats we tested, 9 of them learned it within 8 to 13 trials, which is really quick and a lot faster than some of the gorillas, for example. It's a lot faster than them. We're not claiming, by the way, that goats are particularly more clever than gorillas, but at least it shows that they're relatively good at doing it. And then the other important aspect of the research was we wanted to test their long-term memory. So we tested them a year later, and all 9 of the ones that learned it, basically it was done one summer and then they were tested the summer afterwards. And all 9 of them remembered it instantaneously with no exposure to the box in between those 2 times. And actually, interestingly, 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? No, I think it was early last year. Early last year, this was featured on Countryfile a couple of years ago, and then a TV company making a show about dog intelligence were aware of this, and they contacted me, I think it was last year, and they said, oh, we'd like to test some of the goat. Even though the program was about dog intelligence, they wanted to show intelligence in some other species. So they asked if any of the goats in this study were still present at Buttercups, and actually only Willow was, which was good because she was one of the best ones. So Willow had not seen that box for 4 years, and we went out to test it. I was a bit nervous, actually, testing Willow for the TV cameras, and she hadn't seen the box for 4 years, and Willow got passed out instantly. She didn't need any time at all. So of course that's not in a paper, that's an anecdote and it's one animal, but it shows that they really have long-term memory, and they certainly didn't evolve to get passed out of a plastic box. So it shows that they have generalized memory for things like this. And you might be wondering, one other final thing just to mention on this, you might be wondering what happened with the other 3, did we kill them or something? No, we didn't. So one goat couldn't do it even after 22 trials. So there's variation in any animal species. And the other 2 had horns, and they were trying to break the box to get the food out. So we only had one box, and we weren't keen to lose it. And so we just took them out of trial. So moving on then, in terms of emotion research, we've also been doing some really important work in terms of how to measure emotions. This chart here comes from the human literature, or the human psychiatry and psychology literature. So for any emotion, you can map it on a two-dimensional scale. High arousal or high intensity versus low, and valence in terms of positive and negative. So excited and happy is high intensity or high arousal, and positive, for example. Low arousal and low and negative is sad or depressed, and you can go around and fearful and anxious and relaxed and calm. So emotions are short-lived reactions to facilitate responses to events or information. And it's only in the last 10 years that people have been sort of applying this model to look at animal emotions, and you can certainly do that. And the idea is that you put animals, you don't stress the animals out, so you don't really do that, but you try to create situations in the animals that maybe they're excited or happy, relaxed or calm, and you look at indicators in terms of their behavior or heart rate in those situations and compare and contrast them. So that's a little of what we did with the goats, believe it or not. So basically in the goat study, and this was published a couple of years ago, this is the food frustration, so it's a negative. So what's going to happen in this movie is, well, we've got a goat here, you can't really see it here, but there is a goat in here as well. Somebody comes in, feeds that goat, and that goat is going to be chomping down on food, and this goat gets to watch it for 5 minutes. And goats are highly motivated by food, so the goat is not particularly happy. The goat, it wasn't for hours, it was only 5 minutes, and the goat did get some food at the end. So it's not like we're trying to torture the animals or something like that. We're putting in mild stressors. And we did have a positive situation as well, which was food anticipation, where they were going to get food they really liked, so a bucket of carrots and apples. But just to show you a little bit of the movie, let me explain a little bit before I show you. So we recorded different types of data. You can see a little black belt here. It's like a seat belt, but it's actually holding on something called bioharness, which is developed for studying humans and people involved in sport, and it's basically measuring heart rate and heart rate variability. And the strap is just to hold it close to their chest so that you get a measure. It also takes skin temperature, but heart rate and heart rate variability. The other thing is, once the person comes in and feeds that goat, the person leaves. So the camera is operated remotely. And so the heart rate and heart rate variability is being transmitted via Bluetooth to a laptop, we're recording. Also, there's a microphone set up, so we record the calls that the animal makes. And the idea is that you put animals in a couple of these contrasting situations. Well, not that, because we don't want to stress them out. And then you compare the behaviors in terms of ear postures, tail postures, heart rates between the positive and negative. And essentially what you're looking for are indicators of when they're in a positive state in particular. Because there is a long history of studying negative welfare in animals, but not so many in terms of being able to identify when they're in a positive state. Because the absence of negativity, or the absence of being in a negative state, is not the same as being positive. So let me show you the movie. Oh, by the way, if anyone has a question during this, or any section of it, just feel free to ask me. So you'll hear a person walks in. That goat is just after getting a bowl of food. You can hear the other goat crunching the food. So it's calling, so those calls would have been recorded. And of course, actually I meant to check, I can't remember how many goats we did, but they were involved in a number of different trials. So it's not like just one. So Elodie Briefer, who worked on this, had a huge data set of heart rate and heart rate variability recordings, movies to indicate where the tail and the ear postures were in particular, and the sound of the calls. So I don't go into the details. I have all the papers, by the way, so if anybody is interested in looking at the details, I can give them to you. But one of the key indicators, which is very useful, is in the positive versus the negative, the pitch of the calls was a lot more stable. So the pitch is the fundamental frequency of the call. And I try to explain this always by, imagine that you're not very experienced at public speaking, and you get up to give a talk somewhere, or when I'm telling students about it, I mean, when students have to give presentations, they're often a bit nervous. And when they stand up, or when a person in general stands up to give a talk, often your voice is wavering a little bit when you're nervous, but then when you get into it, it sort of flattens out and becomes a bit more stable. I'm not saying it's like a goat doing public speaking or anything like that, but just imagine the sound of the call wavers a lot more in the negative situation. And this is important because then potentially if you monitored the animals and monitored the output of their calls, well, if you have a group of animals that are producing a lot of calls with sort of unstable pitch, it's indicating that they're probably negative, whereas if they're calling and the calls are really stable, that's probably telling you that the animals are doing okay. This is the food anticipation one. It's not particularly dramatic, but I'll show it to you anyway. But basically in this setup, the goat knows that when there's a person walking towards it, the person is going to shake a bucket and it's containing apples and carrots. But the person walks slowly enough so that the goat has time to call, because obviously once the food is in the goat's mouth, it's not going to be calling. But also you don't want to walk really slowly so the goat gets frustrated then. But this is the food anticipation. There you can hear. Actually, that doesn't sound like apples and carrots to me, now that I think of it, but it was supposed to be. But that's the food anticipation one. So as I said, there were lots of other indicators as well, but that's one of the ones we mentioned. Tail posture in particular and ear posture are good indicators. So the other part, the next step in this research, so Elodie Briefer did that work, and the next step was to actually, well, what are these differences between positive and negative calls of the goats? Well, that's okay, we use a computer and we analyze the calls and see if we can tell the difference between them, which we could. Does it really matter to the goats? Can they tell the difference? So actually, what we did was take the data set of calls, record in these, and we wanted to play them back to other goats to see if they could tell the difference between them. So we had food frustration calls, so negative. We had isolation calls. So in this, the goats were simply put in an enclosure on the other side of the fence from the other goats, but still at the sanctuary. So it was a field that they knew, but they don't like it. But it's only for 5 minutes as well. So we had isolation calls, food frustration calls, and food anticipation calls. So we set up an experiment called a playback experiment, where we play back the calls, and I'll explain how this is done in a second. And the key thing is, can other goats tell the difference between positive and negative calls of other goats? Because if they can, it means that the negative or positive state of one animal in the herd has the potential to affect the rest. Actually, this paper is currently submitted for review. So that's what the sort of experimental enclosure looks like. We've got a test goat here in the middle. At one end there is a speaker. Of course, in the actual setup we use a camouflage netting to cover the speaker, but not in this illustration, just to show you where it is. And then you play back the call to the goat. You play back, and I'll tell you the combination in a second, but you play back positive calls and negative calls. And one of the key things is you measure the behavior of the goat looking towards the speaker. And again, in the setup, we put on the bioharness. Here you can see it just down here. It's just a little small thing, and it's attached with a belt, not particularly tight. That's Jimmy the goat, by the way. He still lives at Buttercups. So then, in terms of the structure of the playback, and how can you tell when a goat can tell the difference between positive and negative calls? Well, we use something called a habituation, dishabituation, rehabituation. Sounds very complicated. It's not really that complicated at all. Basically, in the habituation phase, you play 9 calls from the same type. So 9 calls, 20-second intervals, which is sort of normal intervals for a goat calling. And so let's say these are all positive calls. So they're not all the same calls, they're not all from the same goat, because that would be what's known as pseudo-replication. So they're different calls from different goats, but all taken in the positive setup. So you play 1 call, 1 call, 1 call, and you can imagine the goat in the enclosure. When the first call is broadcast from the speaker, it sort of looks at the speaker and is a bit surprised. But essentially, habituation is the scientific term for getting bored. So as the call goes from 9, 8, 7, 6, or 1, 2, up to 9, you would predict that the goat gets a bit bored with it and basically looks away or loses interest. And then what happens next is you play 3 calls from the different type of call. So you could start off positive and then go to negative calls. And then the key thing is, does the goat know or notice when the change happens? And you could also play 9 negative calls and switch to positive. So we did this. Luigi created 22 sequences involving 57 different calls and did the playbacks to the goats. The rehabituation is not as important, and I'm not going to particularly go into that and bore you to death with details of that. But the key thing is, you can imagine yourself, if you were tested, it would be like playing recordings of people's voices that you know, that you're familiar with, and then after several calls playing the sound of somebody else's voice, and you notice the difference. As I said, I'm not going to go into rehabituation too much. So this is what happens in the experiment. I think in this one it's Heidi. Oh, so it's positive, negative to positive. So food anticipation versus isolation and food anticipation. So Heidi's in the enclosure. The speaker is at the far end. She's wearing the bioharness again, measuring her heart rate variability. The camera is here. And also you'll notice a bit of white, just chalk, to divide up the enclosure, so that when we're coding it afterwards, or when students are coding it afterwards back in the lab, they measure where the goat is during the enclosure. So you can see initially, when the first call happened, Heidi looked at the speaker, sort of, because of course there's no goat there, so she's naturally surprised to hear a call coming from that end. And there she looks up again. So that's after 3. I'm not going to play them all too, by the way, because you get the general impression. But it would have been filmed, there's nobody watching her, and Luigi and another student would have coded the videotapes back in the lab then. So what he's coding for is how often or for how long is the goat looking towards the speaker. And also, of course, we're getting a record of her heart rate and heart rate variability. And these are the results. So this is the behavior or discrimination occurred. So on the y-axis here, it's the mean looking behavior. So it's the rate of looking at the speaker. So as predicted, when Heidi or the other goats in general go in, the first call, there's lots of looking at the speaker. They're a bit surprised. And then gradually over time, for the 9 calls, their interest in that sort of random call coming from the end of the enclosure drops. They're essentially getting habituated, or let's say bored. But then the call type changes. So interesting enough, they didn't look more at the first call immediately. So here we've gone from positive to negative. So suddenly they're isolation calls. And actually, we recently submitted that, as I said, and we've suggested this is a bit of a sort of freezing effect, that the goat has, the animal in this case has noticed there's a difference, but hasn't really looked. But there is a strong difference. By the time the second different call has been played, then the interest in the speaker and they're looking back towards the speaker as well. So we're interpreting this in terms of the change, and statistically there is a difference, but by the second call they've noticed that the call type has changed. And I'm not going to go in, there is no difference, in terms of the heart rate, I don't go into details, but heart rate just dropped off and continued like that throughout. There is some indication that heart rate variability is supporting these data, but I'm not presenting it here. But if anyone wants to see the paper, I'll give it to you. So one of the other, jumping now from sort of short-term emotional changes to long-term stuff. This was the first study that we published from Buttercups. And the key background to the study was using cognitive bias methodology in order to do it. But the key thing we wanted to do was, the goats of Buttercups have different histories. Some of them have been rescued and brought in by the RSPCA and have basically histories of being abused. Other goats have just been donated to Buttercups because their owners can't keep them anymore, but they've had generally good lives. We were curious to see if the goats that had suffered abuse in their previous lives had actually sort of recovered if we were testing their current mood. And the way to do this is a cognitive bias approach, which again comes from human psychology and human psychiatry data. And I'll explain it a little bit more. But moods influence cognitive processes. People in positive moods expect more positive events to occur and less negative ones. That's called an optimistic bias. Whereas the opposite happens for those in negative moods. And there was a key paper published in 2004 in Nature, which I think was the first animal welfare paper ever published in Nature on rats, which introduced this from the psychology and human literature into animal work. And there has been a huge growth in using this approach for testing mood in animals. And essentially it's, in terms of an optimistic or pessimistic bias, it's when you're faced with ambiguous information in the environment. And if you're in a happy mood, you're more likely to respond in a positive way to it. If you're in a bad mood, you're more likely to respond in a negative way to it. And we did this, we assessed this. This was, as I said, this was the first one published from the goats. But essentially what we did, this is an experimental enclosure. There are 5 arms. So the goats start here and they can walk into each of these. And you train the goats, in this setup essentially, the goats were trained to go to the left and they would find a food reward. The goats were trained and they learned, and it doesn't take them long to learn, well, either positive or negative, but essentially they were trained to go left, in this case, to get a food reward, or they were trained to go right and find that there was no reward. Then in the test setup, you close the positive and negative, you give them 3 other places to explore, and you test the speed of exploring. So and the prediction is that goats that are in a more positive mood should explore more quickly, and the goats in the more negative mood will explore more slowly. The analogy I always give is, and particularly in my former job where I wasn't particularly happy, but imagine that you're happy going to work in the morning, getting out of bed, etc., walking to the train or the bus is a lot easier. You've got a bit of a spring in your step. If you're in a bad mood and you don't particularly like where you work, you probably struggle to get out of bed in the morning, or potentially you're not particularly motivated to walk quickly to the bus or the train and come into work. And we can use that analogy, and it's similar for the goats. You can use the speed of exploration to determine if they're in a good mood or a bad mood. So in this case, our sample size, we had a poor welfare group, so goats where we knew the history, they had been abused, all sorts of not so nice things had been done to them, which I won't detail here, compared to goats that had always experienced good care. So then you compare the two. And essentially the results you get are, on the y-axis here, the latency to approach. That's basically the speed at which they explore. So on the left here is positive. So the latency to approach, it took the goats 4 seconds to investigate the place where they thought there was going to be food, essentially. Believe it or not, the negative place, it took them 8 to 12, say, seconds to investigate. Sorry, after jumping forward. So it took them 8 to 12 seconds to investigate here, but they knew already that there wasn't going to get any food. And then you look at the speed for the ambiguous locations. And sure enough, the place closest to the positive location, they explored faster. So you can use this sort of assay. It's a bit like a chemistry assay in the lab or something, but the speed of exploration of the goats can be used. But then what we also did was compare the speed of the positive versus the negative goats in terms of the ones that had, or sorry, I should say the poor welfare goats versus the good care. And these are the light grey and the dark lines. But overall, there's no difference, basically. But the key thing is as well, all the goats used in the study had, even the poor welfare ones, they had to be at the goat sanctuary for a year before this was done. And that's because, of course, the poor welfare goats, when they come in, are quite nervous around people, and it's almost impossible to work with them. So you couldn't do this research. So one of the criticisms, for example, when it came out was, oh, but you should have tested them immediately after they came to the goat sanctuary, because even though they had a history of poor care, maybe they were feeling all right. But that's impossible, because you just can't work with the goats after they've been abused, because they really take a long time to get used to being around people. But essentially, there was no difference in the two. When I presented this at the RSPCA a couple of years ago, actually, they were quite pleased to see this because, well, they don't work so much on goats, but in terms of rehousing things like dogs, if it's the same thing, it essentially shows that even if I think I saw something in the past year where they've replicated this in dogs, actually, in Veterinary Record or something like that. But it shows that once you sort of rehome a dog, or a dog that has suffered from prior abuse, or potentially a dog that suffered from prior abuse, or indeed any other animal, once you give it sort of a TLC, tender loving care, and care for it really well, but that the animal has the potential to recover to mood levels seen in animals that were always treated well. And this sort of went viral at the time. Well, most of our research, when we have important stuff coming out, we do write press releases, and this got picked up by the BBC. But it's important to get the information out there as well, and I've always sort of done that. If you're doing animal welfare research, there's no good just publishing it in the journals and leaving it there. You actually have to get the information out to the general public, because they're the ones with the animals. And it's important because ultimately the goal is to improve animal lives, so you need to get the information out. That's Willow and Teasel, actually, two closely bonded goats. Nearly done, by the way, a couple of movies. So moving on again, jumping onto human-directed behavior. This is something that we borrowed from research that was done on dogs. So dogs, there's been an explosion of research on dog cognition and dog behavior over the last 10-15 years. Often it is compared with the behavior of wolves. So in this setup, actually, it's called the unsolvable problem paradigm. So when they tested it on dogs, and they also tested it on wolves that had been hand-reared and were tamed, but essentially the animal, in this case I'll show you a movie of a goat, not a dog or a wolf, but basically a piece of food is put into a box. The box is left loosely shut, but can be opened. So the animal goes over, gets the food reward out, then you shut the box so that the animal can't, and the animal is faced with what's called this unsolvable problem. And the key thing is, there's going to be a person nearby, and does the animal try to get the attention of the person and get help or not? So when they did it on dogs, essentially the dog looks to the human for help. When they tried it on wolves, hand-reared wolves, so they were tame around people, the wolves didn't look to the humans for help. They tried to break the box open with their teeth and get the food reward. But of course, as I told you at the start of this talk, wolves were domesticated to work closely with humans. So that looking towards the human is thought to be a key part of domestication, and particularly domestication as a companion animal. So we want to test the goats because of course, goats have not been domesticated as a sort of working animal, not to pull plows or to hunt with them or something like that. So we wanted to see if it was a general domestication effect. So this is the training situation. That's Christian Roth, former postdoc, on the left. Actually, there's a student here, Gemma Brett, who is holding a goat, Nadia in this case, I think. And you'll see what happens. But in this case, the box, he's just putting one piece of penne pasta on the ground, and the goat walks over and gets it. So he puts the box over, it's not closed, Nadia walks over, pushes it out of the way, and eats the food. And they got 3 of these trials. And then in the test setup, the box gets closed, and the key thing is, what does the goat do? Does it try to break it out, or get the food out of the box by breaking it, or does it try to request help from the human? Sorry. This was published 2 years ago. And so this is Willow again. She looks up at Christian. The box is closed now, remember. I forgot to say this, but in certain ones, Christian was looking away to see what the goat would do, if it would notice the difference. This is Nadia again. She looks up at Christian. She comes over to Gemma. And remember, livestock are not supposed to be able to do this, are not supposed to communicate with humans in this way. And there's just one other nice little movie. Not all the goats did this. Nadia did it, but it's an extra, we call it elaboration of behavior. This was different trial as well. It wasn't the same one. So yes, Christian smiled, but he smiled after. He was quite lucky. He could have been hurt. Anyway, so not all the goats did that, but quite a few of them. I can't remember what proportion. Oh, sorry. So this shows, this basically shows that goats are also capable of sort of intentional referential communication with humans, and it's not just caused by domestication as a working animal. And finally, the last bit, this came out at the end of August. Again, we borrowed work that was done on dogs a couple of years ago. In this case, we have black and white photographs of human images at one side of an enclosure. Goats have been trained to walk across the enclosure with no photographs there. There was basically a person down on the ground with a piece of food. So goats were trained to walk across the enclosure, then take that person away, and then we put up the 2 photographs. And that is simply because we wanted the goats to walk across the enclosure. But before we planned this, I wasn't sure if they would just ignore the photographs or just walk over and sort of nibble at them or something like that. But when we actually did the research, and this is Christian again, Christian Roth, the goats actually really do pay attention. This is Bernard the goat about to walk across.
That's true.
So they weren't all as perfect as this, but basically the majority of the goats went over to the smiling face. We've got an angry face here and a smiling face here. They were tested on the left and right side. There was a right side bias, which I won't go into in detail here, but they were more likely to approach the smiling face when it was on the right hand side. There was no human gender effect either. We also tested male faces. But it shows that they can tell the difference between angry and happy human faces. and they also stare at you in the face quite often. So this went nuts at the end of August when it came out. Actually, the press release, the end of August, the August bank holiday, I was due to have 2 days off that included Monday bank holiday, and instead I ended up doing press interviews all day long on bank holiday Monday and the day after on my theoretical day off. But that's Washington Post, that's the BBC. It was reported by hundreds of news outlets worldwide. I mean, we have had publicity in the past for stuff, but this particularly surprised me. But again, it's about changing perception. And it is possible that other livestock can do this, but you need the right animals to do it. And people are saying, yes, but buttercups, they have this ideal life where they have positive interactions with humans. And yes, of course, they do have positive interactions. But what this does is show that they have the cognitive capacity to do that, given the right conditions. So getting back to the earlier thing about the stupid goats, well, hopefully you'll get the impression that they're not so stupid from the stuff that I've presented to you. And maybe they're a bit more like this. We didn't create this, by the way. One of the some reporter created it, but I borrowed the photograph because I think it's particularly good. So maybe not quite Einstein, but certainly not stupid. These are many of the people that have been involved. It's quite an international team. So Elodie is Swiss, Luigi Italian, Natalia and Karina Brazilian, a Scot even, Amy is local, Ben from Australia, and other Italians and Germans, etc. And there are more as well. Funding, and believe it or not, we get no funding in the UK, and it's almost impossible. And I've had 3 big grants fail this year, and nobody wants to give us any money. And I spend most of my time is not doing nice experiments with goats, it's writing grants that fail. Anyway, we're still managing to keep it going, but these are some of the funding agencies that have given us money. And that's it. Thanks for your attention. I think I may have gone over time, but I slowed down a little bit. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, we've got some online, but also they just said thank you when you did slow down.
Well, we maybe take some of the questions online first, since there's a bit of a delay, and that gives you time to think of any questions we have.
We've got one question first, and then more might come through. So it's Lou Tasker, I don't know if you know her. She says, thanks for the talk, really good. She loves all the indicators and the videos. And so the question is, and this is a common theme, what indicators can we feasibly use in the field, or how can we make this feasible in the field, and how can we get people clued into those indicators?
Yeah. So with the emotion stuff, that was one of the key things, because as I said, we had movie files to look at their behaviors, ear and tail postures, we had heart rate physiology, heart rate variability, and with the vocalizations. We didn't think, what we were doing was trying to find 1 or 2 indicators that were then supported by all of those. Because of course it is impossible to measure. We had 30 different variables or something. Ear postures are particularly good. We needed the heart rate variability data and the heart rate data to see if it would back up those other more simple indicators. So the sound of their calls and probably ear postures. So if I remember correctly, ear postures forward, that was generally associated with positive states, ear postures back, more negative states. And actually that has led on to me working on, that came out in 2015, and as a result I'm working on 2 big projects in relation to poultry welfare. Because if you imagine, if any of you know, of course chickens are not goats, but chickens are highly vocal. Broiler chickens are produced in huge warehouses with 20, 30, 40,000 birds. If you've ever seen anything like that, the one thing that will strike you is they're constantly calling. So I've been involved in research aimed at identifying what types of calls indicate when chickens are in positive and negative states, and potentially deploying technology to monitor chicken welfare in these large flocks. Because if you find that, say, just off the top of my head, if you've got 30,000 birds in a large hangar-like facility and they're mainly producing positive calls, then it's an indicator potentially they're in a positive state, or the reverse, negative. But so that's where it has led on. But you're looking for simple indicators. The short answer is simple indicators, sound of the call, and things like tail and ear postures.
I suppose I have a sort of comment to to just feed into that.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's why I'd say, to me, partnerships between the sort of academic and the practical side are just really important to develop this as well.
Yeah.
Because if I always think of DNA as an example, because once upon a time that was this vague concept of inherited units, and then they spent years and years and years mapping the human genome, and people would say, what use is this? And it just takes time to work down, to drill it down from these complicated concepts, find out what can we look at that, as you say, isn't.
So on those chicken projects that I'm working with engineers, sound engineers, because I know the welfare stuff, but I'm working with electronic engineers because I don't do the programming. And actually the postdoc on the second grant, we're working in China. He went to China on Friday, actually. We're testing kit in China, or he is testing kit for the next 6 weeks. And of course I applied to do similar work on goats here, but it was turned down. Of course we didn't get that. But theoretically you could do it on cattle as well.
Does anyone have a question in the room? Yes, Jimmy.
Question. Would you, and sorry if this was at the start and I have now forgotten.
It's fine.
But
there was a lot in there.
I know that one of the, you said that about changing perceptions is one of the main goals. Would you say with the two pieces of research you've talked about today that the primary goal from the outset was to be able to show the public something that will change perceptions, or was the primary goal to use the data for something else, or integrate it into livestock?
I don't think you can separate the two, to be honest. For the emotions ones, of course, we were looking at, like the first question, even though we were studying maybe 30 different variables from heart rate, variability, ear posture, tail posture, the sound of the calls, and all of that, we wanted to boil it down into one or two. So yeah, I guess the primary goal of that one was to find indicators of emotions. But many people don't even sort of accept that animals are capable of emotions. So that's one of the other things that we were trying to do when those results came out. And also the fact that people find it almost strange that you're adopting an approach used for studying human emotions in psychology. Well, you can put humans in those sort of scenarios as well and record their heart rate variability and the sound of their voice or something, and you probably get related results. So even the concept of, to all of you, it's like preaching to the converted. I'm sure you all know that animals are fully capable of experience emotions, and getting back to, I know I haven't measured his heart rate, but I can tell the difference between Jack's face when he's happy and when he's not particularly happy, to be honest, because I've seen both. But so we need experience of them, but many people don't even realize. They think of their cats and dogs as having emotions, but beyond that, they try to disconnect, because if they have to buy the meat off the supermarket shelf, they probably prefer not to think about that. Sorry, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
but both, basically.
Both, but it seems like that change in perception was the real thing that you wanted.
I have another PhD student who's writing up at the moment, and she's specific, Caroline Spence, and she's been looking at public attitudes to animal welfare and sentience as well. Maybe another day she can come along and talk about her research. She's due to submit her thesis in about 6 weeks, so she's a bit busy at the moment. But yeah, so I've been working on both as well through Caroline and that guys.
Anybody else?
I guess it was sort of following on from that point, actually. I was just interested in how this has been received, and particularly if you've spoken to the farming industry.
Actually, I gave a talk at the British Goat Veterinary Society annual meeting back in May, but goat farmers go to that as well, and really positive. And actually afterwards, many of the farmers were sending me movies and clips and telling me stuff, and telling me anecdotes. And actually some of the research that we've done has been based on the anecdotes that we get from people working with the goats at the sanctuary as well, in terms of testing their intelligence using a sort of standard problem solving. But one of the farmers told me that when I presented the stuff in terms of the goats telling difference between positive and negative moods in humans, and I'm not, I should be careful to say, I'm not saying that the goats are mind reading. I am saying that they can learn to tell difference between positive and negative faces. But she told me that she very much had the impression that the goats in her herd could tell what her mood when she went in to tend to them in the morning, because she said sometimes she would even be depressed and go in and have a cry, actually, and the behavior of the goats around her was very different to when she went into the goats and she was in a positive mood. So she wasn't surprised. And the goat farmers as well, they are already aware that goats are particularly clever, but you nevertheless have to carry out sort of standardized experiments to do it. So yeah, but that's a very long-winded answer to say, yes, the goat farmers hear about it, and the goat vets too, and we have communication going on with them, because it's important.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Was there any difference between the goats with a negative prior experience in the human-directed behaviour when they were looking for
We didn't test it in terms of that, because at Buttercups, as I said at the start, there are about 130, 140 goats. Willow is there in that photograph as well. I see Vern. When I go there, it's the same goats that sort of hang around, but not all the goats hang around people as closely. So they do vary in their sort of personality. But for doing the cognitive testing, we always test the ones that it's easy to work around. It's not that we're biasing our results. What we are doing is biasing our results towards goats that wouldn't be sort of stressed in that setup. Because if you were using goats that weren't particularly comfortable around us, if they don't do something, then you don't know if it's because they can't do it or they're just too nervous around people. So we don't look at that effect for the other cognitive testing. One of the things, actually, we had 9 versus 9, which is a fairly small sample size for that comparison of poor welfare and good welfare, but we also split it with 5 and 4 male and female, and the indication, even though the sample size is really small, was that females that had suffered from prior abuse were in a much better current mood, actually. But I wouldn't push that result so far because the sample size is so small.
That is what you mentioned, the dog study though, but I'm pretty sure that's what they found in the dog study, wasn't it?
And it has been found in several other studies for humans as well, and a few other species, I think. But as it's an anecdote more than robust evidence, because you're dealing with 9 versus 9 and then 5 versus 4, or 10 versus 8, yeah. I should say. Any other questions online?
No, just a couple more. Thanks, great talk. And also someone says, keep up the tweeting. And they think it's a great way to engage everyone in science.
It is, actually. I probably tweet too much, but yes. I tweeted about coming here earlier. Oh, did you? Oh. I wasn't sure who was in charge of tweeting here, so it's
I sent it to Faye, actually. Social media.
But one of the other things is, you've seen a little bit of the research that we do with the goats. I mean, Buttercups has benefited hugely from the publicity. One, it's a great place to work, and the focus in Buttercups is really the goats, which is unlike some other places that I've been that keep animals. The focus is on potentially making money, and even though they look after the animals, the focus is really on making money. Whereas, of course, they need the money to keep going and everything, but at Buttercups, the focus is the goats come first. And that's why it's a joy to work there. But also, I mean, in terms of, they have gained worldwide publicity from this, so they're really well known now, although often they get they're deluged with new goats rather than new money after our studies come out. But potentially, if you have centres with dealing with horse research worldwide at any sanctuaries, this, not the same work, but similar work is achievable at these places, particularly if you're dealing with sort of, let's call it, relaxed animals. So there's lots of scope for research, not just working. I mean, Karen McComb's group, Sussex and Leanne Proops, who already do work in the UK, but there's lots of scope for potential research in other countries as well, not just in the UK, if you have the right conditions.
There's no other questions. I'll just say another thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
For
Thanks for having me. No worries.
To build our staff knowledge on all things animal welfare related. And thanks very much to everybody for coming, and to those who are listening online and in future. Yeah, thanks again to
Okay, thank you.